Boardroom Bound, episode 119, The Increasing Relevance of ESG Reporting and Its Effect on Company Strategy, with Amy Rojik.
You have to start somewhere, and it starts by really thinking, what are the risks and opportunities? Because ESG is not just about risk, right? It's about opportunities as well. What are those things that are material to your company? What are those things that are going to be most impactful to your organization, but also to those that you touch?
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Amy Rojik. And she is a partner in BDO's National Assurance Practice, and she directs their Center for Corporate Governance and Financial Reporting. So she oversees the firm's communications and governance efforts. And she's been a boardroom expert for about 25 years, advising individuals and organizations across the spectrum. And we're going to talk about some of the best practice knowledge that they've been sharing and finding over how the world has changed in the boardroom in the past year. Oh, and I should point out, Amy is in a very exclusive Boardroom Bound Club, the 2-time podcast guest club. You're going to want to hear from her. Jump into the show today. Amy Rojik, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you, Alexander, for having me back.
We were joking before it started here that I feel like back when I was growing up with Saturday Night Live, they had sort of a repeat host honors club, and there are very few that we've had back on the show. You are one of those. We'll link to the original episode. I think it was number 54 back in December of 2019, so glad to have you back. But boy, the boardroom world has changed like it has for most of us in the last year and a half.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. Isn't that the truth? And I guess I must have done something right on the last episode for you to have me back. So I really appreciate that, and I'm honored to be in the repeat podcasters.
Well, for me, I guess let's just start with the place probably many of our listeners are thinking of. But the world has changed so much. The apple cart got upset very quickly, and we are year plus into the pandemic now, and things have changed, and some of these things will be permanent. What is the finger on the pulse that you're seeing from all the various board members you're talking to? Do people feel like they're a bit stabilized now? They have a sense of where they are and where they should be, or are they still just racing to try and catch up today?
You know, I think it varies from company to company. I think that probably at the onset of the pandemic was quite an adjustment for the majority of board members. I mean, shifting to an all-virtual environment. Many of that was right in the middle of their shareholder meeting season for public company boards, adjusting to that, adjusting to the frequency and the cadence that meeting with their fellow directors and management teams required. I think we're starting to see maybe a level setting of that type of engagement that was happening, weekly, if not daily. I think that's kind of righting itself and getting back to some normalcy for the majority of enterprises. But, it really varies. There's some organizations out there that are still in, definite liquidity risk mode, while others have been thriving. So I think it's going to continue to evolve. And then I think you add on to the pandemic the other events, shall we say, that have happened worldwide that have really kind of changed the governance outlook, prioritization for many, many organizations. And that's just, we could talk forever about all of those issues. But I think from a purely pandemic focus, I think we're starting to see, hopefully, the light at the end of the tunnel. Although, to your point, I think there's a lot that's going to have been changed substantially. I think, no longer are boards necessarily going to need to meet in person all of the time like they were. I think some boards will get back to doing just that, but I think many other boards may be taking maybe a different approach. So that's just one aspect of how this has changed. As with all organizations considering the kind of the integration of the remote workforce, if you will, and how that may continue, how all of that gets accounted for going forward. Will be interesting to see what companies, are doing as part of their strategy or their longer term planning. So lots of information around that, but lots of other things to discuss. So happy to follow your lead here.
Well, it's interesting to that point. I would say for some people, they're saying it's not all bad. Like I have some friends on some Fortune 500 company boards who go, I'm really excited that I don't have to jump onto a plane for every single board meeting to stay multiple days because there's a big cost of the travel portion of it as well. And they're saying we're meeting more frequently. We might be on Zoom every month now to cut through some things that are urgent and important. We still want some in person, but it's changing the dynamic of the board. And of course, if you have a board of people that have been together for a long time, have experienced a good culture, maybe that doesn't impact them as much. But if you have a board with a lot of newer people, you're about to bring on new board members, now it's a very different cultural game. And how do you indoctrinate them, put them up to speed? I'm sure people are coming to you asking like, Amy, how should we be navigating this? What are we doing? What advice are you giving out?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it's funny that you brought that point up because I've talked to many directors on both sides, right? So you mentioned the longer term, the closer knit board, shall we say, that have been working with each other for quite a while, have kind of a good rapport and understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses potentially in the boardroom and can kind of probably more easily navigate that in a remote setting where you have many other board of directors. I have several colleagues of mine that have newly come onto boards, one just before the pandemic where she was onboarded. I think she had one in-person board meeting before everything went virtual. And then I've had other directors who have actually been asked to join boards amid the pandemic, so only virtual meetings for those individuals. So I think from their lens, and again, this is kind of anecdotal, but from their lens, it's been quite challenging to really fully immerse yourself in the board environment. It's probably taken a lot longer to maybe feel that level of confidence in the boardroom and speaking up or voicing your opinion and just as you're trying to get the lay of the land, to your point of the culture of the board, how do things transpire? What is the tone and tenor of the board you're on? And it's hard when you can't necessarily read people's body language or you don't have those opportunities in between meetings to grab a cup of coffee or pull someone aside to chat for a few minutes. So I think that's been a big adjustment for many members. I also think it's a big opportunity, though, to your point, because it does allow for more frequent touch points. I think too often directors maybe previously have kind of focused on those, scheduled calendar meetings that occurred, whether it was quarterly or more frequently as situations warranted, but probably had that in their mind, that cadence of interactions, whereas now I think, that's kind of a little bit out the window and that, everybody is accessible 24/7. No one's on a plane. No one has that excuse of being, at 30,000 feet and unreachable. So, it's just a different world. It's a different way of transacting in the governance arena, if you will.
Well, this is an example probably of why so many people are still reaching out to you, but in your role as a partner at BDO and leading their Center for Corporate Governance, you guys are continuing to put out great materials that have the finger on the pulse of what everyone's trying to solve. For example, I know the latest piece that showed up in my inbox, I think it was in the last week, was all about the ESG reporting landscape and how that is changing. Now, we could go back before this crisis started, and it varied a little bit by industry, even by company within industry, how many people were, let's say, fully indoctrinated into thinking, I need to focus on ESG, and that meant different things to different people, even if we all spell the same three letters. Can you give us a sense of what's going on? Because clearly ESG is at the forefront for so many companies in terms of what they're thinking about now, but it seems like every board's handling it differently.
Well, again, ain't that the truth? So I think one of the things that I want to maybe underscore for, there's probably two types of boards out there right now. There's boards that have probably been looking at environmental, social governance, or sustainability, which sometimes those two terms are used hand in hand or in exchange for one another. They've been looking at this for quite some time, decades for some. And not just looking at it, but when I say that, I mean actively thinking through how measures around climate change, around water scarcity, around pollution, around social and ethnic diversity, around pay practices and fairness, around composition of the board and approaches to corporate governance. All of those things that, those have been things that have impacted companies forever, but they're now becoming much more. The word in vogue isn't really the right term, but it's becoming much more of a global concentration, and that charge has been led definitely from Europe and other areas of the globe, and I think the U.S. has been kind of slow to pick up on that. So you have the companies in the first bucket that have been really looking at this for a while, and some of those may be multinational companies where they've either, had the additional pressure from regulators in terms of mandating certain regulations and reporting requirements and activities. And then you may have the other bucket, which are companies that are just beginning to really focus on this. And, a lot of those may be considered smaller companies that are just really starting to think about, their business practices with an ESG lens, some of which because of competitive nature, others of which, maybe looking at regulatory, which we can get into, and others just because they're starting to hear more from investors, from the institutional investor community in particular, with, your Larry Fink letters and your other major institutional investors really getting on board with showing the value proposition that a lot of these approaches, whether it be through climate, whether it be through diversification of your employees, whether it be looking out for your stakeholder welfare, if you will, to coin the Business Roundtable's focus on broadening the definition of a corporate purpose to not just increasing profits for shareholders, but really increasing the benefit to all stakeholders that your organization touches. So I think there's a lot of folks that are getting a little bit maybe lost in the complexity of what ESG can represent and don't quite fully understand the landscape, which is why we just produced our evolving landscape guide on ESG to help folks kind of understand what's currently going on. And again, that's changing kind of minute by minute, if you will, but at least to give a snapshot of what they should be looking for, and especially when companies are feeling the pressure to be disclosing their activities, disclosing their position on certain ESG measures and metrics, and how to even go about doing that. For many of our clients, the question becomes, where do I even begin? And a lot of it, the more and more board members I've spoken to, both seasoned and maybe not so seasoned in this space, are really starting to understand that, there's really not a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but you do need to start somewhere. And a lot of what I tell companies is, and this is based on a lot of discussion with a lot of different folks that do sit on boards, as well as observing some of the things that, I have privy to in my discussions with them, is you have to start somewhere, and it starts by really thinking, what are the risks and opportunities? Because ESG is not just about risk, right? It's about opportunities as well. What are those things that are material to your company? What are those things that are going to be most impactful to your organization, but also to those that you touch, whether it be your customers, your vendors, your employees, your lenders, and of course your shareholders or your target investors, if you will. So I think you have to kind of do that inventorying and kind of, self-reflection. And then you might surprise yourself and start realizing, well, there's a lot that I'm actually doing already. And you have to find out throughout the organization where those things are being done, who's responsible for it, are you measuring it in some way? If you're not, how can you capture that information? And then you kind of have to think about, well, then how do I use all of this information to tell my story to the public? And what other data am I missing? Is there things like rating agencies? So all the various companies out there, whether they're institutional investors or other organizations that are collecting data on companies and essentially ranking them based on their ESG profiles, and all of that is very varied and complex, so I won't get into those details. But then you also have proxy advisors. What are they focusing on? What are they looking at this shareholder season that I can expect them driving questions from my shareholders about? What does that look like? And is that meaningful to what I'm trying to accomplish as a business? And then kind of stacking that up against truly your business priorities and your strategy. How is my business strategy that my management teams are developing reflecting all of these risks and opportunities that this ESG world is embracing? And again, you kind of look at it through a few different lenses, but ultimately you have to look at how can my practices that I'm promoting lead to profit, but also lead to a more sustainable future and be responsive to all of those stakeholders that I just mentioned. So it's a big pie to bake, but you have to start with the ingredients, right? And you kind of mix it around and you get it right. And I will say it's not something you can certainly do overnight, but it is an evolution. And I'd spoken to one board member she said she's been on this journey for a very long time. They brought in advisors, and this is a large public entity. And she said, we had to start somewhere. And, while we started a few years ago, our track has changed. As we get better at this and we look at it, we're able to, now we have a data structure so we can actually look at the data we're producing and make decisions in real time based on the information in front of us. But it's all about building blocks, and you can't be afraid to start somewhere. I'll pause there.
And to that point, Amy, this is such a big and important topic, and I would think most boards are doing something on ESG. Even if we went back a year, they might not have been doing 100%. We might not all understand 100% the way you've described it, that there's so much to cover. But let's pretend we could be in a utopian world solving ESG. And again, it might vary a little by industry. If you were building a board from scratch today, what would be the best way you would advise an organization? This is where and how you could cover ESG. I talk to different organizations. They've got some piece in this committee and some piece in this committee, and not everybody has all the same committees, et cetera. In your mind, what would be the most logical way you think you might structure solving this topic to be able for the board to stay on top of it?
Well, I think first you start out by asking the question, what's in the board's purview today? What are they doing? How is that being taken up, I would believe, in the organization? So who within the organization is actually looking at some of this stuff? And if you think about, the three letters, if you think about the E, the S, and the G, so you probably have some companies that think, well, this is really about risk. For lack of a better place to put it, we'll put it to the audit committee to figure all this out. But you start realizing, if you start looking at some of the issues are around human capital management, which is a huge topic that, has only gotten larger with, the George Floyd case, with diversity and inclusion and all of the state legislation that's looking at board composition. And then you start saying, well, maybe it's the non-gov committee that should be taking this on. But then you start realizing, well, now you're hearing more and more about, well, what about how we're, planning executive compensation? Well, how are we rewarding good behavior around ESG, and what do those metrics look like? So that becomes the compensation committee's purview, right? So, and then you have other institutions like banks and financial services that may have a risk committee. So does it belong there? I think when boards sit down and actually map this out, because your point earlier, this is such a big undertaking that it may not fit nicely into one committee. Or you may find that, we want a committee devoted to this. But ultimately, like with cyber, with other very significant things that are pervasive throughout an organization, it sits with the full board. So your full board has to have a working knowledge of what the company is doing, right? And then I think when you kind of break it down, and you have to look at the composition of the board. What is the audit committee doing? Are they so overloaded with other risk matters that maybe this doesn't make sense? Maybe it does belong in the nomination and governance committee to start with. And maybe there's elements from the audit side when it comes to reporting, for example. A lot of companies are deciding how do I ensure that my ESG disclosures that are now being heavily looked at, as evidenced by the new administration that has announced its significant focus on ESG, particularly climate and human capital management. And I should say human capital management was really under the prior administration under Chairman Clayton. And climate change has been around for a while in terms of materiality, but with recent announcements on the SEC's focus, whether it be through the Division of Examinations or through the Division of Enforcement, they're going to be looking at activities, and there's already been a public announcement through the acting chair that they're requesting public feedback on the adequacy of ESG disclosures. Is there enough information coming from companies that are allowing investors to make good investment decisions in this area? So I think you really, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think you're going to continue to see evolving practices at the board level, but it does need to be defined, and I think you're going to see a lot more adjustments to committee charters, for example, from the board, where you're actually defining responsibilities for certain ESG measures or focus areas assigned to committees of the board. Or again, if you decide to have an ESG committee, that's a luxury probably for some companies with larger boards, perhaps. But yeah, I think you're going to continue to see this becoming a focal point, just as companies, for the past several years have been wrestling with what to do with cybersecurity. Kind of a similar thought, if you will, in terms of where is the risk in the organization and who best is prepared to handle it, and who on the board may already have experience in integrating ESG considerations in other companies. How can they help in the process? So I think you're going to continue to see this elevate itself, and you're also going to be wanting to ensure that you have the right folks within your management team throughout the organization identified as well. And they might come from, obscure places that you may or may not have been expecting, that assistance to come from. So.
And I suppose the answer, it depends, is always a good answer, but sounds terrible to many people. But let's use that exact answer because it's fair. Let's use that to step back for a second and to talk about some of the conversation you regularly have with other people in the boardroom going like, how do I become the best boardroom person? And what do I need to know? What do I wish I knew when I started? And I love your sort of answer. Well, it depends based on, the approach and the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Can you expand that? Because I know that conversation I had is valuable for all of our listeners today.
Yeah, well, it's just kind of as I iterated before. No board is a one-size-fits-all approach, and I kind of wish I had, when I first started down this journey about, a decade ago, I'm dating myself, but when I started really engaging with directors and listening and speaking to them on a whole variety of topics, it became apparent to me more and more so that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and particularly for would-be directors, those seeking board positions, for many of those individuals, because I speak to, people on both sides of the fence, right? So those looking in and those looking out. But for those looking in that are trying to advance to a board seat, I feel like a lot of them may be perhaps a bit naive about what it takes to be on a board. And, you really need to consider, and I've actually done several discussions lately that address this issue. You really need to do your due diligence when you're looking at corporate governance role. Not every board is going to be this magical place that you find. Board seat does not mean it's going to be all, roses and sunshine. It's hard work. And the more you know up front about who is on the board, who will be on the board with you, what does that look like? Is there a domineering voice in that boardroom? Is it the CEO? Is it the lead director? Is it a handful of board members? Does everybody have the ability to engage? What does that look like? What are their backgrounds? What is the skill set and the experiences that each of the directors bring to the boardroom? And then what's missing, right? As you look at your company's strategy or your long-term, plans or the disruptions that are occurring in that industry, does the board have the right mix of skills or at least the access to advisors that can help them navigate that? I think those are really incredible questions to ask yourself. And it's, again, not just because you want desperately to sit on a board, but are you the right fit? Where do you fit in that landscape? What are your special skills and talents that you'll be impactful to that particular board? So I think it's really important to really look carefully at the opportunities that you're seeking, and then align them with your own skill set. You're not going to be a fit for every single board, and I think where you can make the most impact might be in some surprising places. I think some of the other obvious things are, what's the nature of the industry? Do you have that particular skill set? Is it necessary to have that industry knowledge, or is the board seeking someone from outside? What's the board looking for? How well have they identified their own needs, right? So I think that's a telling situation. And then what's the management team? Who's running the company? What does that look like, not just in the C-suite, but at multiple levels down? What is their plan for succession? How are they building up their team? What does it look like from their vendor's lens, their customer lens, their shareholder lens? There's so much information out there that's available to do your due diligence, particularly for public companies. So that's probably, there's so much information out there that's readily available. I think, it really behooves would-be board members to do their homework. And then for those that are sitting on the board, it's a continual education process. There's no sense of comfort level in any good board member, right? If you can't get comfortable on your board seat. One of the best things I've heard lately, and I've heard it from a couple of people, so I won't attribute it to one individual. But a board seat is not a Supreme Court justice seat. You're not appointed for life. You're appointed for a period of time, and you need to prove your worth each and every time you're up for re-election or before then. If you're not kind of contributing, then you probably shouldn't be in that seat, right? And you have to do those self-assessments and that awareness to recognize that, because your talents may be better suited elsewhere. So I think it's knowing yourself and knowing your fellow board members and the needs of the organization that will really help make you a better board person.
I like that a lot, especially the Supreme Court philosophy of just bring your A game every time and make sure you're adding value back to the organization. And, Amy, I'm sure people are asking you this on a regular basis. So I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball, or maybe it's your magic 8-ball, and look into there and peer into the future for us, because most of us would never have guessed where we'd be from a year ago today. And if we look maybe a year or two out, what are some of the major things that you think will continue to be changing in the boardroom?
Well, let's see. I can say with some, near-term certainty, I think if you look at despite the liquidity challenges for many companies, there's a significant amount of capital out there. And, the rise of the kind of the SPAC deals, or the special purpose acquisition companies, that's something that's really telling, and how boards evolve based on those, I think, is going to be another avenue for, directors to see a lot of movement and opportunities to bring some talent in. I think you're going to have a lot of emphasis on the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I don't think that is certainly not a flash in the pan. And I know, Alexander, you and I just participated in the Women 2020 on boards, where they've unveiled the fact that they've exceeded their goal of 20% women on public boards by 2020, and now they've renamed themselves to 50-50 women on boards. So I think that's a lofty goal, but I'm very confident that, as a society, we're going to get there, because there is very increased attention on not only board diversity, but diversity within a company, and speaking much more broadly beyond gender, beyond, getting female directors placed on boards. But California, as you're probably well aware, recently passed legislation that is now looking at other underrepresented, folks that need to be represented on boards. So I think you're just going to continue to see more of that push. You see NASDAQ has a proposal that's sitting with the SEC about diversity. You have the SEC itself looking at, again, human capital management practices throughout your company, because your workforce is probably most companies' largest intangible asset, and that needs to be managed appropriately, whether it's talent acquisition and retention, upskilling to face disruptions in technology and other industry changes. Whatever the case may be, I think you're going to continue to see a lot of that, and of course the equity in all of that. So is your employer and employee ratio from the terms of like executive compensation, what does that look like? For years we've talked about say on pay, but now you have a new ratio with regard to CEO pay compared to employee. And is that a meaningful benchmark? So, the jury's a little bit out on that. Some say yes, some say no. But what it's also highlighting is truly there is a lot of disparity in how folks are paid across various industries, various professions, and what does that look like? And how do you embrace the fact that there's a lot of folks that are kind of shut out of the process, and how do you change your diversity within your companies by elevating those communities that maybe don't have the same opportunities as some other places where the normal talent pools have been being, driven from. So I think there's just a lot of opportunity. So that would be my crystal ball in terms of that. But I think globally, we're going to continue to see significant shifts in industries, in the speed at which we're conducting business, and the volume of information that companies have both exposure to and can be exposed by. I think there's huge risk and opportunity in that. And I think managing that data, that governance of data is definitely an area that you're going to see huge growth and interest in. And it's not just cyber breach, it's truly understanding the vast amount of data that's going to be accessible in seconds as opposed to, waiting for your quarterly numbers to pop up. I think it's here, and companies need to be very forward-thinking in their analysis of that, and again, assessing, do we have the right folks around the table that are going to help address all these risks and opportunities that are at our feet?
Well, Amy, you've dropped a lot of knowledge on us today, and I would encourage our readers, lots of great reports and information being put out by BDO, and I can hear that coming through in your fantastic talking points today. We were delighted to have you on the show. Thank you for sharing all of your insights and helping us to be boardroom bound.
Well, thank you again, and look forward to working with you again in the future, Alexander. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Amy Rojik. You can see why she's been a repeat guest on this show. So much knowledge about the boardroom space, and boy, was there a lot to cover about how things have changed in the past year. It's been about a year and a half since she was on the show, and the world is a very different place. But we're grateful for Amy and all the great work and lots of really good material that BDO puts out that you are going to want to have at your fingertips to stay up on the cutting edge for all the stuff going on in the boardroom space. Now, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to several of those as examples. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.